My name is Jack Thompson. I'm 32 years old, and I've been running from my own mind for as long as I can remember. I served in the Korean War as an Army Ranger, but I came back with scars that don't show on the outside. Well, except for the one on my cheek. The real damage is inside. Nightmares. The kind you can't wake up from even when your eyes are wide open. Sometimes I hear their voices, my unit, my brothers, calling out to me from the dark. They didn't make it home, but somehow I did, and I've hated myself for it every day since. After my third attempt to end it all, my doctor said I needed a change. He called it nature therapy, like fresh air and trees could fix what's broken in me. So here I am, driving my beat-up 1955 Airstream Overlander into the middle of nowhere, the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. The locals call this place the Deadlands. It's not on any map, and the guy at the gas station said that's probably for a good reason. "You sure you want to camp out there?" Frank Wilkins asked me as he filled up my tank. He was an older guy, missing his left arm, but his eyes were sharp, like he'd seen things he didn't want to talk about. 3 hikers went missing last summer. Never found a trace of them. Shrugged it off. "I'm not a hiker," I told him. "Just looking for some peace and quiet." Frank gave me a long look, then leaned closer like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "The trees out there, they whisper at night," he said. "And that fog? It ain't natural." I nodded politely and paid for the gas, figuring he was just trying to scare me or maybe sell me something extra like a flashlight or bear spray. But as I drove deeper into the mountains, his words stuck with me. The road twisted and turned through dense pine forests, the trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. It felt like they were leaning in, watching me pass by. After an hour of driving, I finally reached the valley, the place locals called the Deadlands. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my tires crunching gravel. I found a clearing surrounded by massive pines and parked my RV. The air was heavy with heat. It hadn't rained in weeks, and everything felt dry and brittle. As I stepped out to stretch my legs, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees like whispers, soft and low, almost like voices. I shook it off and got to work setting up camp. My RV was modified with reinforced doors and blackout curtains, leftover paranoia from the war, and I made sure everything was locked up tight before settling in for the night. The first thing I noticed was how dark it got once the sun went down. It wasn't just night, it was pitch black like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Then came the fog, a thick wall of gray that rolled in fast and hugged the ground like it had a mind of its own. I sat inside my RV with a book and tried to ignore how quiet everything was outside. But then I heard it, a sound carried on the wind that made my skin crawl. Jack. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling trees. But then it came again, clearer this time. Jack. I froze in place, gripping the edges of my book so hard my knuckles turned white. It sounded like someone calling my name from deep in the forest, a voice that matched perfectly with the rhythm of the wind through the pines. "It's just your head playing tricks on you," I muttered to myself as I reached for my medication bottle. My doctor had warned me about hallucinations when my PTSD acted up, so I popped 2 pills and washed them down with water before crawling into bed. But sleep didn't come easy that night, not with those whispers echoing in my ears. When dawn finally broke, I woke up groggy but relieved to see sunlight streaming through the curtains. That relief didn't last long when I stepped outside and saw something that made my heart pound. The door to my RV, the one I had locked tight before, going to bed, was wide open. I stood there staring at the open RV door, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked, sometimes even triple-checked, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But now it was wide open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the dry dirt, and peeked inside. Everything looked normal, at least at first. My bed was still made, my book was still on the table where I'd left it, and nothing seemed out of place. but something felt wrong, like the air inside had shifted somehow, carrying a faint smell I couldn't quite place. I checked all the locks again, testing each one with a firm tug. They were still working fine. Maybe I'd been careless and forgot to lock it last night. That's what I told myself, even though deep down I knew better. As I stepped outside to clear my head, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees like it had a secret to tell. The whispers were back, not as clear as last night, but still there, hidden in the sound of the breeze. I shook it off and decided to do something productive. Gathering firewood seemed like a good idea. It would keep me busy and distract me from whatever was gnawing at my nerves. I grabbed my hatchet and wandered into the forest, sticking close to the edge so I wouldn't get lost. The trees were massive, towering giants with rough bark that seemed older than time itself. Their branches stretched high above me, blocking out most of the sunlight and leaving everything below in shadow. As I chopped at a fallen branch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd glance over my shoulder or pause to listen, but all I heard was the occasional creak of wood and the distant rustle of leaves. Still, that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. When I returned to camp with an armful of firewood, I noticed something strange near my RV. Footprints, big ones, pressed deep into the dirt around my campsite. They were about 18 inches long and had only 4 toes, each one ending in what looked like sharp claws. My first thought was bear tracks, but these didn't look right. Bears have 5 toes, and their prints don't usually look this clean or defined. These were different, almost human-like, but much larger. I crouched down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the edges of one print. It was fresh. The dirt was still soft around it, and there were more leading off into the forest. Whatever made them had been here recently. I stood up quickly and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see something moving between the shadows. But there was nothing. Just those towering pines standing silent and still. Probably just some animal, I muttered under my breath as I carried the firewood back to camp. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Later that afternoon, while sitting outside with my radio playing softly in the background, something else happened that sent chills down my spine. The station suddenly cut out mid-song and was replaced by static, a loud hiss that made me wince. Then came voices, faint at first but growing louder as I turned up the volume. They sounded old, like recordings from decades ago, and they weren't. Anything you'd hear on a regular broadcast. Unit Bravo requesting air support. Coordinates are... The voice crackled and faded before another took its place. A woman's voice this time. Please, someone help us. I froze in place as fragments of conversations played over the static. Military communications, from World War II mixed with desperate cries for help. None of it made sense. These weren't live broadcasts. They couldn't be. I tried changing stations, but no matter where I turned the dial, all I got was static and those haunting voices. That's when it hit me, whatever this place was, it wasn't normal. After the strange radio incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, and every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, made my skin crawl. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the footprints were from some animal, and the radio was just picking up interference. That's all it had to be, right? Still, I decided to leave camp for a bit and drive into town to grab some supplies, anything to feel normal again. I packed up quickly, locked the RV tight, and hopped into my truck. As I started driving down the dirt road, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following me. The road twisted and turned through the dense forest, but after about 20 minutes, something strange happened. I noticed a familiar tree, a crooked pine with a lightning scar running down its trunk. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I saw another familiar landmark, a large boulder shaped like a bear's head. My stomach sank as I realized what was happening. Somehow, no matter which direction I drove, the road kept leading me back to my campsite. I stopped the truck and got out, staring down the road ahead. It stretched on like normal, disappearing into the trees. But when I turned around to look behind me, there it was, my RV parked in the clearing. I hadn't turned around, I hadn't made any loops. But somehow, I was back. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into the truck and tried again. This time, I drove faster, taking sharp turns and even veering off onto smaller paths that weren't on my map. But no matter what I did or how far I thought I'd gone, every single time, I ended up right back at camp. By the time I finally gave up and parked next to my RV again, the sun was already starting to set. The fog rolled in just like it had the night before, thick and heavy, swallowing up everything beyond a few feet, in front of me. I sat in my truck for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of prank? Or maybe it was something else. Something worse. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of the truck and head inside the RV. The whispers started almost immediately. Soft at first, but growing louder as the wind picked up outside. Jack. This time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Men's voices, women's voices, even children's voices. They called my name over and over again, their tones shifting between pleading and mocking. I locked every door and window in the RV and pulled all the blackout curtains shut. Then I sat on my bed with my back against the wall, clutching a flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. The night dragged on slowly. Every creak of wood or gust of wind made me jump. At one point, something brushed against the side of the RV. A low scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. I held my breath, listening as whatever it was moved around outside. The footsteps were heavy, too heavy to be an animal, and they circled the RV slowly before stopping near the door. For what felt like hours, everything went silent again, until suddenly there was a loud thud on the roof. I scrambled off the bed and grabbed a kitchen knife from one of the drawers. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there in the middle of the RV, staring up at the ceiling where more thuds echoed above me. Then came another sound, a dripping noise coming from one corner of the room. I turned slowly toward it and saw something oozing through a crack in the ceiling, a thick black sap that smelled metallic, almost like copper. It dripped onto the floor in slow, sticky globs that seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light of my flashlight. That's when I knew. This wasn't just in my head anymore. That night, the air felt colder than it should have, even for the mountains. The fog outside was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like it wanted to seep inside. I sat at the small table in my RV, staring at the black sap still dripping from the ceiling. I'd cleaned most of it earlier, but the smell, metallic and sharp, still lingered. It made me uneasy, like I was breathing in something I shouldn't. I tried to distract myself by tinkering with a broken flashlight, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every little sound outside made me jump. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves. It felt like the forest was alive, watching me, waiting. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, crunching through the dry dirt and leaves just outside. My heart started pounding as I froze in place, straining to listen. The steps circled the RV slowly, pausing every few seconds like whoever, or whatever, it was wanted me to know it was there. I grabbed my knife from the counter and stood perfectly still, my breath shallow and quick. The footsteps stopped near the back of the RV. For a moment, everything went silent again. Then something hit the side of the RV, hard. The whole vehicle rocked slightly from the impact, and I stumbled back against the table. Another hit came a second later, this time from the roof. Whatever was out there wasn't just walking around anymore. It was testing me. I wanted to run outside and scare it off, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I crouched down near one of the windows and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtain. At first, all I saw was fog and shadows. But then, something moved. It was big, much bigger than any person, and it moved between the trees with an unnatural grace for something so large. Its arms were long, almost dragging on the ground as it walked upright on two legs. The fog seemed to cling to it like a second skin, making it hard to see clearly. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like embers burning deep within a fire. They scanned the RV slowly before disappearing behind another tree. I ducked back down under the window, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. My mind scrambled for answers. Was this some kind of animal? A bear? No. Bears don't walk like that, and they definitely don't have glowing eyes. The RV shook again as something brushed against it, a low scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't leaving anytime soon. I stayed crouched there for what felt like hours, gripping my knife so tightly my hand started to cramp. The footsteps eventually faded into the distance, but I didn't dare move until dawn broke through the curtains. When I finally stepped outside that morning, my campsite looked like a war zone. Deep scratches ran along one side of the RV's metal exterior, and more of that sticky black sap-coated parts of the roof where I'd heard those thuds last night. But what really got me were the footprints. Massive prints pressed deep into the dirt all around my campsite. They were just like the ones I'd seen before, 18 inches long with only 4 toes and sharp claw marks at each tip. I followed them for a few yards into the forest before stopping cold. There were marks on one of the trees, huge claw marks carved deep into its bark as if something had been sharpening its nails. That's when I realized, whatever this thing was, it wasn't just passing through, it was hunting me. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares came. I'd see Marilyn, my wife, standing at the edge of the forest, her blonde hair glowing in the moonlight. She'd call my name, her voice soft and familiar, but there was something wrong about it. Her eyes, they weren't hers. They were empty, like the light inside her had been snuffed out. When I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, I could still hear her voice echoing in my head. Jack, come to me. At first, I told myself it was just my PTSD acting up again. Hallucinations were nothing new for me. My doctor had warned me that stress could trigger them, and God knows I was stressed out here. But these felt different. Too real, and they didn't stop when I was awake. One morning, after another sleepless night, I stepped outside to find something that made my blood run cold. On the ground near the RV were footprints, barefoot prints. But they were smaller this time, like a woman's. They led away from my campsite and disappeared into the forest. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Could it have been Marilyn? No, that wasn't possible. She was gone. She'd been gone for years. But then, why did these prints look so much like hers? I followed them for a few yards into the woods before stopping myself. My hands were trembling, and my heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal. That night, things got worse. I was sitting inside the RV with all the doors locked and curtains drawn when I heard it again. Jack. Her voice drifted in through the walls like smoke, soft and sweet but laced with something sinister. I clenched my fists and tried to ignore it, but then came the knock, a single, sharp rap on the door. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body refused to respond as fear rooted me to the spot. Then came another knock, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed my knife from the counter and crept toward the door, every muscle in my body tense. Slowly, I unlocked it and swung it open, shining my flashlight into the foggy darkness outside. There was no one there, but just as I was about to close the door again, I saw something at the edge of the clearing, a figure standing between two trees. It was Marilyn. or at least it looked like her. She was wearing the same dress she'd worn on our last anniversary before everything fell apart. "Jack," she said softly, her voice carrying through the still night air. "Come with me." My throat tightened as tears welled up in my eyes. It couldn't be her. It couldn't. But she looked so real, so alive. I can't," I whispered. She tilted her head slightly, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she said. "We can be together again." I took a step forward without even realizing it, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. But then something stopped me, a flicker of movement behind her in the shadows. That's when I saw it, the thing that had been haunting me all along. It stepped out from behind a tree, a massive figure at least 9 feet tall with long arms that nearly touched the ground. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur except for patches where pale, human-like skin showed through. And its eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce straight through me. The creature stood silently behind Marilyn, or whatever this thing pretending to be Marilyn was, and stared at me with those glowing eyes. "Jack," she said again, her voice now cold and hollow. "Come with us." I stumbled back into the RV and slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the latch. Outside, I heard heavy footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew exactly how terrified I was. Then came another knock on the door. Soft this time, but somehow more menacing than before. I pressed my back against the wall and clutched my knife tightly, praying that whatever this thing was would go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The next morning, I woke up outside the RV. I don't remember leaving it. I don't remember unlocking the door or stepping out into the night. But somehow, I was there, lying on the ground about 200 yards into the forest. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. My head throbbed and my mouth was dry as sandpaper. I sat up slowly, trying to piece together how I'd gotten there. The last thing I remembered was locking myself inside the RV after seeing Marilyn, or whatever that thing pretending to be her was. As I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. In front of me stood a massive tree, larger than any of the others in the forest. Its bark was dark and twisted, and carved into its surface were faces. Dozens of them. Each face wore an expression of terror. Eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. Some were detailed enough to look almost lifelike, while others were rough and faded, like they'd been worn down over time. I stared at the carvings, my stomach twisting into knots. One face stood out among the rest, a young man with curly hair and a freckled nose. He looked familiar, but it took me a moment to place him. Frank Wilkins' son. I'd seen his photo at the gas station, a framed picture sitting on the counter next to Frank's shotgun. He'd gone missing last summer, along with 2 other hikers, and now his face was here, carved into this tree like some kind of sick memorial. I stumbled back a few steps, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just some strange coincidence anymore. Something was happening here, something terrible. As I turned to head back to camp, something caught my eye near the base of the tree. A small, leather-bound journal wedged inside a hollow, in the trunk. It looked old, its edges worn and faded from years of exposure to the elements. I pulled it out carefully and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was messy but readable, and each entry was dated, starting in 1932. The journal belonged to a forest ranger named Thomas Grayson. His first few entries were normal, notes about wildlife sightings and weather conditions. But as I kept reading, they took a darker turn. He wrote about hearing whispers in the wind and seeing strange figures moving between the trees at night. He described finding footprints, large ones with only 4 toes, and waking up outside his cabin with no memory of leaving it. Then came the entries about it, the creature he called the Shadow Beast. He wrote that it could get inside your head, pulling out memories and twisting them into nightmares. It collects them, he wrote in shaky letters, like some folks collect stamps. The later entries became more frantic, almost unreadable as his handwriting grew messier with each page. He wrote about seeing faces in trees and hearing voices calling his name, voices that sounded like his wife's but weren't hers. The final entry ended mid-sentence. If anyone finds this journal, don't stay here. It feeds on... I closed the journal and stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. Everything Grayson described matched what I'd been experiencing. The whispers, the footprints, Marilyn's voice. It wasn't just me losing my mind. This thing, the shadow beast, it was real. When I finally made it back to camp, my RV door was wide open again. The locks had been broken from the inside this time, twisted and bent like someone had forced their way out. I stepped inside cautiously, gripping my knife tightly as I scanned every corner of the room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then I noticed something on my pillow. A single strand of blonde hair. Marilyn's hair. I sank onto the bed, clutching the journal tightly against my chest as tears filled my eyes. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marilyn standing at the edge of the forest, her blonde hair glowing in the moonlight, calling my name. But it wasn't her. I knew that now. Whatever was out there, it was using her face, her voice, her memory, to mess with me. I spent most of the night sitting at the table flipping through Thomas Grayson's journal over and over again. The words felt like a warning, but it was too late for me to leave. The road wouldn't let me go, and even if it did, I wasn't sure I'd make it out alive. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside to find something that made my stomach turn. The faces on the tree, the ones I'd seen yesterday, were gone. The massive pine stood silent and empty now, its bark smooth as if nothing had ever been carved into it. But that wasn't all. There were new footprints leading away from my RV, human ones this time. Barefoot prints, just like the ones I'd seen before, but smaller. They looked like they belonged to a woman. I followed them cautiously into the forest, gripping my knife tightly as I moved between the towering pines. The air was thick and heavy, and every step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The footprints led me to a dried-up creek bed, the same one Frank had warned me about at the gas station. It hadn't rained in weeks, but now black water filled the creek, bubbling faintly as if it were alive. I froze at the edge of the water, staring down at my reflection in its surface. But it wasn't just my reflection staring back at me. There were others. Faces, dozens of them, floating just beneath the surface of the water. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rock as my heart raced in my chest. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, gripping my knife so tightly my hand started to ache. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then something moved. It stepped out from behind a tree, a massive figure covered in dark fur with glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. Its arms hung low, almost dragging on the ground as it moved toward me slowly. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like those glowing eyes had frozen me in place, holding me there as it got closer and closer. Then came the voices. Soft, at first, but growing louder with every step the creature took. They weren't coming from its mouth. They were inside my head. Jack. Marilyn's voice echoed through my mind, followed by others. Familiar voices from my past. My unit's voices. My brothers who didn't make it home from Korea. Why? Did you leave us? One of them whispered. You should have died with us, another said. I clenched my fists and shook my head violently, trying to drown out the voices. You're not real, I shouted into the empty forest. None of this is real. The creature stopped just a few feet away from me, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly as if it were studying me. Then it tilted its head and reached out one long arm toward me. I stumbled back again, finally breaking free from whatever hold those eyes had on me. Without thinking, I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward camp. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Though deep down I knew those locks wouldn't keep that thing out if it really wanted to get inside. The whispers started again almost immediately, soft and low at first, but growing louder as the wind picked up outside. "Jack," Marilyn's voice called out from somewhere near the window. I pressed my back against the wall and clutched my knife tightly as tears streamed down my face. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The next day, I woke up with a strange clarity. I wasn't sure if it was the fear or the exhaustion, but something inside me clicked. I couldn't keep running from whatever was out there. If I wanted to survive, I had to figure out what it wanted, and why it wouldn't let me leave. I spent the morning flipping through Thomas Grayson's journal again, searching for answers. The entries were scattered and frantic, but one stood out to me. It mentioned a cave hidden behind a waterfall in the creek, the same creek that had been dry until last night when the black water appeared. Grayson had written that the cave held proof of what the creature was and what it did to its victims. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but at this point, I didn't have a choice. If there was even a chance of finding answers in that cave, I had to take it. The fog rolled in early that evening, thicker than ever before. It clung to my skin as I made my way back to the creek, following the bubbling black water upstream until I reached the waterfall Grayson had described. The sound of rushing water filled the air as I stepped closer, my boots slipping on the wet rocks. Behind the waterfall was a narrow opening in the stone, a cave just big enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into the rock that looked ancient and worn. The deeper I went, the darker it got until all I could see was what my flashlight illuminated. Then I saw them. Rows of objects lined the walls of the cave, dog tags, wedding rings, photographs, all carefully arranged like some kind of twisted collection. Each item belonged to someone who had disappeared here over the years. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all dating back decades. In the center of the cave stood an altar made of bones, human bones stacked and arranged with precision. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, shining my flashlight over the gruesome display. That's when I heard it, the whispers. They weren't coming from outside this time. They were coming from inside my head. "Jack." Marilyn's voice echoed softly, followed by others. Voices from my past, voices from people I didn't even know. I stumbled back against the wall as images flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine. A man in a military uniform crying over his fallen comrades. A woman clutching her child as flames consumed their home. A boy hiding under his bed while something scratched at his window. It all hit me at once. The creature wasn't just feeding on people, it was feeding on their memories, their pain, their trauma, and somehow, Dr. Hoffman was connected to all of this. I remembered what Frank had said about other veterans disappearing here, others who'd been sent by Hoffman for nature therapy. It wasn't a coincidence. Hoffman knew about this place, about this creature, and he'd been sending people here on purpose. I gripped my flashlight tightly as anger bubbled up inside me. Hoffman had made a deal with this thing, a deal to give it victims in exchange for relief from his own nightmares. He'd sacrificed others so he wouldn't have to live with his own pain anymore. The whispers grew louder as I stumbled out of the cave and back into the forest. The creature was close. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to break, but I wasn't going to let it win. I ran back to camp as fast as my legs could carry me, the whispers chasing me through the trees. The creature was close. I could feel it in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the forest itself was closing in around me, but I wasn't going to let it win. Not this time. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I knew the locks wouldn't hold. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a plan. If this thing fed on memories, on pain, then maybe I could use that against it. Maybe I could give it what it wanted, and take it down in the process. I grabbed my propane tanks from under the counter and started rigging them together. It wasn't a perfect setup, but it didn't have to be. All I needed was one big explosion, enough to destroy the RV and whatever was inside it. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, filling the air around me like a storm. "Jack," Marilyn's voice called out, soft and sweet but laced with something dark. "Come with me." I clenched my teeth and kept working, ignoring the tears streaming down my face. This wasn't her. It never was. It was just another trick, another way for this thing to get inside my head. When I finished rigging the tanks, I sat down at the table and waited. The knife was still in my hand, but I didn't need it anymore. My plan was simple. Lure the creature inside, let it feed on my memories, and ignite the explosion before it could escape. It didn't take long for the footsteps to start again. Slow and deliberate, crunching through the dirt outside. The RV rocked slightly as something brushed against its side, and then came the knock, a single sharp rap on the door. I took a deep breath and stood up, unlocking the door slowly before swinging it open. The fog outside was so thick I could barely see anything at first. But then, there it was. The creature stood just a few feet away from me, its glowing eyes burning like embers in the darkness. It tilted its head slightly as if studying me, and then stepped closer. "Jack." Marilyn's voice echoed from somewhere behind it, soft and pleading. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." I stumbled back into the RV, leaving the door open behind me as I gripped my knife tightly. "You want my memories?" I shouted at the creature. "Take them." The glowing eyes narrowed slightly as if it understood what I was saying. Then it stepped inside. The air grew colder instantly, so cold that my breath fogged up in front of me. The whispers filled my head again, louder than ever before as images flashed before my eyes. Memories of Marilyn laughing on our wedding day. Memories of my unit calling out for help during the ambush. Memories of blood and fire and screams. The creature moved closer until it was towering over me, its long arms reaching out like claws ready to strike. But instead of attacking, it stopped and stared into my eyes. That's when I felt it. The pull. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper than that, something inside me being ripped away piece by piece. My memories, the good ones and bad ones, were being drained from me like water pouring out of a broken dam. I fell to my knees as tears streamed down my face, clutching at my chest as if trying to hold on to what little I had left. But even as everything slipped away, one thought stayed clear in my mind. This ends here. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for the lighter sitting on the table and flicked it on. The creature's glowing eyes widened slightly, as if realizing what was about to happen. But by then, it was too late. The explosion tore through the RV in an instant, a deafening roar that sent flames shooting into the sky and shook the ground beneath me. The heat was unbearable, but all I felt was relief as everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. The forest, the whispers, the creature. It was all gone. I was lying on the ground a few yards away from where my RV used to be. Now, there was nothing left but a smoldering wreckage, twisted metal and ash glowing faintly in the early morning light. I sat up slowly, my body aching all over. My ears were ringing, and my head felt foggy, but I was alive. Somehow, I had survived. The air was different now, lighter, almost peaceful. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest for days was gone. The fog had lifted, and for the first time, I could see the trees clearly. They stood tall and still, no longer leaning in like they were watching me. I stumbled to my feet and looked around. There were no footprints, no black sap, no signs of the creature anywhere. It was like it had never existed. But then I saw them. Faces in the smoke rising from the wreckage. They weren't carved into trees or trapped in water anymore. They were free. Dozens of them. Men, women, even children. Floating upward like they were finally being released from whatever nightmare they'd been trapped in. I recognized some of them. Frank Wilkins' son, the hikers who had gone missing last summer, even a few soldiers from old photos I'd seen in town. They looked at peace now, their expressions calm as they disappeared into the sky. I stood there watching until the last face faded away. Then I turned back toward the dirt road and started walking. When I reached town later that day, everything felt surreal. People went about their business as if nothing had happened, as if they didn't know what had been lurking out there in the Deadlands all this time. I made my way to Dr. Hoffman's office without thinking. He was sitting at his desk when I walked in, his face pale and his hands clutching his head like he was in pain. "They're back," he whispered hoarsely when he saw me. "All of them. Every memory. Every scream." I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked out. As I left town for good, I glanced back at the mountains one last time. The forest looked quiet now, peaceful even, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Because there, at the edge of the clearing where my RV had burned to ash, was a single set of massive footprints leading into the trees. My name is Lisa Miller, and this is the story I wish I could forget. It happened 2 years ago, but it still feels like yesterday. I was just 14 at the time, and my family thought it would be fun to take a trip to the mountains. Fun. That's what we thought it would be. But by the end of it, nothing about that trip was fun. It all started when we arrived at this place called Howling Pines. Even the name sounded creepy, but my dad, John, said it was just a quiet campground in the Appalachian Mountains where we could unplug and spend some quality family time together. My mom, Margaret, was excited too. She loved nature and had been talking about this trip for weeks. My older brother, Tom, wasn't thrilled about being stuck with us for a whole weekend, but he came along anyway. The drive up there was long and winding. The trees seemed to stretch forever, their branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. When we finally reached the campground, I felt this weird chill run down my spine. The place looked abandoned. There were a few RVs parked here and there, but no people in sight. "Looks like we've got the place all to ourselves," Dad said cheerfully as he parked our RV near a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. As we stepped out, I noticed something strange. Scratch marks on some of the trees. They were deep and jagged, like something with claws had been here recently. "Probably just bears," Mom said when I pointed them out, but her voice sounded unsure. While Dad set up the RV and Mom unpacked food, Tom wandered off to explore. He came back holding a torn backpack he'd found near an old fire pit. "Look at this," he said, tossing it onto the picnic table. Inside was an old camera with undeveloped film still in it. "Cool," Dad said, brushing it off like it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the ground, we heard it for the first time. The howling. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was low and guttural at first, then rose into a high-pitched wail that made my skin crawl. "What is that?" I whispered. "Wolves," Dad said casually, though his face looked tense. But deep down, I knew it wasn't wolves. The howling didn't stop. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the mountains like it was coming from everywhere at once. I sat close to Mom by the campfire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. Dad poked at the fire with a stick, pretending everything was fine, while Tom just stared into the woods like he was trying to see where the sound was coming from. "Probably just coyotes," Dad said again, but this time his voice wasn't as confident. That's when we heard footsteps, slow, heavy ones, crunching on the gravel path behind us. We all froze. Out of the shadows came an old man, hunched over and leaning on a walking stick. His clothes were worn and dirty, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. "Evening," he said in a raspy voice. "You folks shouldn't be here." Dad stood up quickly, putting himself between us and the man. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound polite but firm. The old man shook his head slowly. "No one can help you now," he muttered. His eyes darted toward the woods like he was expecting something, or someone, to come out of them. "The moon's too bright tonight," he added, almost whispering. "They'll come for you." Mom stood up, her voice calm but nervous. "Who will come for us?" "Them," he said, pointing toward the trees with a shaky finger. "The ones who don't belong in this world." "All right, that's enough," Dad said firmly, stepping closer to the man. "You need to leave." The old man didn't argue. He just turned and started walking back down the path, muttering to himself as he went. Before disappearing into the darkness, he stopped and looked back at us one last time. "When the howling stops, that's when you should be afraid." We all stood there in silence after he left, staring at each other like we were waiting for someone to say it was just a joke. But no one did. "Creepy old guy," Tom finally said with a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just some local messing with us," Dad added, though he didn't sound convinced. "Mom didn't say anything. She just pulled me closer and stared into the woods like she was trying to see what might be out there." That night, after we locked ourselves inside the RV, I couldn't sleep. The howling continued for hours, growing louder and closer until it felt like it was right outside our door. And then, just like the old man said, it stopped. The silence was worse than the howling. The silence was deafening. I lay on the small bed in the RV, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The howling had stopped, but now there was this stillness. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was watching you. Tom was in the bunk above me, tossing and turning. "Can't sleep either?" I whispered. "Not with Dad snoring like that," he muttered back, trying to sound normal, but I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. Mom and Dad were in the back of the RV, their voices low as they whispered to each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I heard Mom say something about leaving first thing in the morning. That sounded like a good idea to me. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't the howling. It was softer, like scratching. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The scratching was coming from outside, near the RV door. My throat felt dry as I whispered, "Tom, do you hear that?" He didn't answer. "Tom?" I said again, louder this time, but when I looked up at his bunk, it was empty. My stomach dropped. Where had he gone? I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window by the door. The moonlight lit up the clearing outside, and that's when I saw him. Tom, standing just a few feet away from the RV, staring into the woods. "What is he doing?" I whispered to myself. I wanted to call out to him, but something stopped me. It was like a voice in my head telling me not to make a sound. Instead, I crept over to Mom and Dad's room and shook them awake. "Tom's outside," I whispered, urgently. "What?" Dad said groggily as he sat up. "He's outside," I repeated. Dad grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the door while Mom stayed with me, her hand gripping mine tightly. When Dad opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, Tom didn't even turn around. He just kept staring into the trees like he was in some kind of trance. "Tom!" Dad called out sharply. Tom flinched and turned around slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. I thought I saw something," he said quietly. "What did you see?" Dad asked as he led Tom back inside. "I don't know," Tom said after a long pause. "It looked like eyes. Probably just an animal," Dad said quickly. shutting and locking the door behind them. But Tom shook his head. It wasn't an animal. He glanced at me then, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever it was standing on 2 legs. When morning came, it didn't feel like morning at all. The sky was gray, and the air felt heavy like it was pressing down on us. None of us had slept much after what happened with Tom. Dad tried to act normal, making coffee and talking about going for a hike, but no one was in the mood. Mom kept glancing out the window, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tom sat at the table, poking at his cereal without eating it. I stayed close to Mom, feeling safer when I was near her. "Let's just pack up and leave," Mom finally said, breaking the silence. Dad sighed. "Margaret, we drove all this way. We can't just leave because of some weird noises in the night." "It's not just the noises," Mom snapped quietly. "Something's not right here, John." Before Dad could respond, there was a loud knock on the RV door. We all froze. For a second, no one moved or said anything. Then Dad stood up and opened the door cautiously. It was Ranger Wilson, the campground manager. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and a friendly face, but today he didn't look so friendly. His uniform was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Just doing my rounds." He looked past Dad into the RV and gave us all a small nod. "Everything all right here?" Dad hesitated before answering. "Yeah, everything's fine." Ranger Wilson didn't look convinced. "If you folks hear or see anything strange, you let me know right away," he said firmly. "Like what?" Tom asked suddenly. The ranger's eyes flicked to Tom, then back to Dad. "Just anything unusual," he said vaguely before tipping his hat again and walking off. After he left, Mom turned to Dad with a look that said, "I told you so." But before they could start arguing again, Tom spoke up. "I want to check out that other RV," he said. "What other RV?" I asked. "The one I saw last night," Tom replied. "It was parked near the edge of the campground." "No way," Mommy said immediately. "We're not going anywhere near that." But Tom was already grabbing his jacket. "I'm just going to look," he said stubbornly. "I'll go with him," Dad said reluctantly. I wanted to stay behind with Mom, but something made me follow them instead. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just didn't want to be alone. The 3 of us walked through the trees until we reached the edge of the campground where another RV was parked. It looked old and beat up, with faded paint and broken windows. The door was slightly open, swinging back and forth in the wind. "Hello," Dad called out as we approached. No answer. He stepped inside cautiously while Tom and I waited outside. A few seconds later, Dad came back out, his face pale. "What is it?" Tom asked. Dad didn't answer right away. He just handed us something, a piece of paper he'd found inside. It was a drawing of some kind, a crude sketch of a tall figure with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. Underneath it were 3 words scribbled in shaky handwriting. "They are watching." We hurried back to our RV, none of us saying much. Dad kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone, or something, to be following us. Tom held on to the drawing tightly, his knuckles white. I stayed close to Dad, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. When we got back, Mom was waiting for us at the door. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, noticing the look on Dad's face. Dad didn't answer. He just handed her the drawing. Mom stared at it for a long time, her face pale. "John," she whispered, "we need to leave. Now." Dad nodded slowly, his usual stubbornness gone. "All right," he said. "Let's pack up." We started gathering our things, quickly stuffing clothes and food into bags without bothering to fold anything. The air inside the RV felt thick with tension, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something bad to happen. Tom kept looking out the window while Mom and I packed. "It's too quiet," he muttered. "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "There's no birds, no animals, nothing." I froze. He was right. The forest outside was completely silent, not even the rustle of leaves or the chirping of insects. It was unnatural, like the whole world had stopped moving. "Lisa," Mom said sharply, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Help me with this bag." I nodded and grabbed the bag she was holding, but before I could take it, the RV shook violently. "What was that?" I gasped. Dad ran to the door and peered outside with his flashlight. "Nothing," he said quickly, but his voice sounded nervous. "It felt like something hit us," Mom said, her eyes wide. "Probably just a branch falling," Dad replied, though none of us believed him. Then we heard it, a low growl coming from somewhere nearby. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Inside," Dad said firmly, stepping back and locking the door behind him. We all sat there in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the growling get louder and closer. It circled the RV like whatever was out there was trying to find a way in. Tom suddenly pointed at the window. "Look," he whispered urgently. I followed his gaze and saw them, two glowing eyes staring at us through the glass. They were bright, yellow and unblinking, set into a shadowy figure that was too tall to be human. Mom grabbed my arm tightly as Dad moved toward the window with his flashlight. He shined it directly at the figure, and just like that, it disappeared into the trees. "What was that?" I whispered shakily. Dad didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "We're leaving now." He started up the RV and pulled out, onto the narrow dirt road that led back to town. But as we drove, something strange happened. The road didn't end. No matter how far we went, it kept looping back to where we started. "This doesn't make any sense," Dad muttered under his breath as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. Mom looked out the window nervously. "John, are we trapped?" No one answered her question. But deep down, we all knew the answer. The RV jolted as Dad hit the brakes for the 5th time. We were back at the same clearing, the one where we had parked when we first arrived. It didn't matter how far he drove, or which turn he took. We kept ending up in the same place. "This is impossible," Dad muttered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mom sat beside him, her face pale and her hands trembling. "John, what's happening?" she whispered. "I don't know," Dad replied, his voice strained. Tom was pacing back and forth in the cramped RV, running his hands through his hair. "We're stuck," he said finally, his voice shaking. It's like something doesn't want us to leave." I sat on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to make sense of everything. The growling, the glowing eyes, the looping road. It felt like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. Then Mom spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Lisa," she said, turning to me. "Where's that backpack Tom found yesterday?" "It's under the table," I replied automatically. Mom reached for it and pulled out the old camera inside. She stared at it for a moment before saying, "There's film in here. If we can develop it, maybe it'll tell us something." Dad looked at her like she was crazy. "Margaret, how's that going to help us right now?" Mom ignored him and grabbed her small portable photo printer from one of the cabinets. She'd brought it along for family pictures, not that we'd taken any yet. She carefully opened the camera and removed the film, then loaded it into the printer. The RV was silent except for the hum of the printer as it developed the photos one by one. When the first picture came out, Mom froze. "What is it?" Tom asked nervously. Mom held up the photo with shaking hands. It showed a blurry image of a tall figure standing in front of a tree, its glowing eyes unmistakable. "That's what I saw last night," Tom whispered. Mom flipped through more photos. As they printed, each one worse than the last. There were pictures of claw marks on trees, shadowy figures watching from behind bushes, and even one of an RV door covered in blood. "Who took these?" I asked softly. Mom shook her head slowly. Whoever owned this backpack, they knew something. Was out here. Dad stood up suddenly and grabbed his flashlight. I'm going outside, he said firmly. John, no. Mom cried. I need to figure out what's going on, Dad snapped. Before anyone could stop him, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the clearing. The rest of us stayed inside, watching him through the window as he shined his flashlight into the trees. At first, there was nothing, just shadows and silence. But then, we saw them. Figures moving between the trees, too fast to be human, but too big to be animals. Dad! I screamed. He turned toward us just as something lunged at him from the darkness. A tall creature with glowing eyes and sharp claws. Dad stumbled backward, swinging his flashlight wildly as he tried to fend it off. Get inside, Mom shouted, through the window. Dad managed to break free and ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind him. His arm was bleeding where the creature had scratched him. What was that? Tom asked frantically. Dad didn't answer right away. He just looked at us with wide eyes and said quietly, They're not animals. They're something else. Dad sat down heavily on the couch, clutching his bleeding arm. Mom grabbed the first aid kit and started cleaning the wound, her hands shaking. We need to stop the bleeding, she said quietly, but I could hear the fear in her voice. Tom paced back and forth, muttering, This can't be happening. This can't be real. I sat in the corner trying to stay calm, but my heart was racing. My mind kept going back to what Dad had said. They're not animals. They're something else. The RV felt like it was closing in on us, the walls too thin to keep out whatever was out there. The growling had started again, low and steady, like it was surrounding us. Then I noticed something strange. The growling wasn't as loud for me as it was for the others. In fact, it sounded muffled. I reached up and adjusted my hearing aid, thinking maybe it wasn't working properly. But when I turned it off completely, the growling disappeared altogether. Wait, I said suddenly, sitting up straight. I can't hear it anymore. Mom looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I pointed to my hearing aid. When I turn this off, the growling stops. Tom stopped pacing and stared at me. What are you talking about? I hesitated, trying to make sense of it. I think the sound is fake. Fake? Dad asked, wincing as Mom wrapped his arm in a bandage. Like it's not real, I explained. It's not actually coming from outside. It's in our heads. Tom frowned. That doesn't make any sense. It does, Mom said quietly, her eyes wide with realization. That's why we're so scared. It's not just what we're seeing. It's what we're hearing, too. Dad shook his head. But how? How are they doing that? I don't know, Mom admitted, but Lisa might be onto something. She turned to me. If your hearing aid blocks out the sound, maybe that's why you're not as affected as we are. I nodded slowly, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time all night. Maybe we can use that, I said. How? Tom asked. I thought for a moment before an idea came to me. If we can block out the sound for everyone, like with noise-canceling headphones or something, maybe we won't feel so scared anymore. Maybe we'll be able to think clearly. Mom looked around the RV quickly, her eyes landing on her phone and a pair of earbuds on the counter. She grabbed them and handed them to Tom. Try this, she said. Tom put in the earbuds and played some music on Mom's phone. After a few seconds, he nodded slowly. It's working, he said. The growling is gone. Mom handed me another pair of earbuds from her bag and started rummaging through drawers for more headphones or anything else that could help. But before we could figure out a plan, there was a loud bang on the side of the RV. We all froze. The banging came again, harder this time, shaking the whole vehicle. They're trying to get in, Dad said grimly. The growling grew louder, at least for them, and Tom ripped out his earbuds in panic. They're right outside, he shouted. No, I yelled back, grabbing his arm. Keep them in. Don't listen to it. But then we heard something else. A voice. Help me. It was faint but clear, a woman's voice coming from outside. Mom's face went pale as she whispered, "It sounds like me." The voice outside sent chills down my spine. It sounded exactly like Mom, but it couldn't have been her. She was right here with us. "Help me. Please," the voice called again, desperate and shaky. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. That's my voice," she whispered. Dad stood up, his face pale but determined. "It's a trick," he said firmly. "They're trying to lure us out." Tom backed away from the window, shaking his head. "How are they doing that? How do they know what you sound like?" No one had an answer. The banging on the side of the RV started again, harder this time, shaking the walls. The growling grew louder too, mixed with more voices now. Dad's voice, Tom's voice, even mine. "Let me in." A voice that sounded like me cried out from the darkness. "Please, I'm scared." I felt my stomach twist into knots. Hearing my own voice like that was wrong. So wrong, it made me feel sick. "They're mimicking us," Mom said quietly, her hands trembling as she clutched Dad's arm. "They're trying to confuse us." "Well, it's working," Tom snapped, pacing back and forth again. "We can't stay in here forever." Dad grabbed his flashlight and stood by the door. "We're not going out there," he said firmly. "We'll wait them out." But deep down, I think we all knew that wasn't an option. The banging was getting louder, and now it wasn't just on one side of the RV. It was all around us. Whatever was out there was circling us, testing us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Then something slammed into the roof so hard it made the whole RV shake. "They're on top!" Tom shouted. "Stay calm," Dad barked, though his voice wavered. I grabbed Mom's hand and squeezed it tightly, trying to keep myself from panicking. My hearing aid was still off, so I couldn't hear the growling or the voices as clearly as they could, but I could see the fear on their faces. And that was almost worse. "We need a plan," Mom said quickly, her voice shaking but steady. "We can't just sit here." Dad nodded and looked around the RV like he was trying to come up with something, anything, that could help us. "What if we distract them?" I said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at me. "What do you mean?" Dad asked. "They're focused on us right now," I explained. "But if we make noise somewhere else, like outside, they might go after that instead." "That's risky," Mom said immediately. "It's better than waiting for them to break in," I argued. Dad hesitated for a moment before nodding. "She's right," he said. "We need to buy ourselves some time." He grabbed a small portable speaker from one of the cabinets and handed it to Tom. "Take this," he said. "We'll play something loud and throw it out there." Tom looked terrified, but nodded anyway. "Okay," he said quietly. We huddled by the door as Dad set up the speaker with his phone, playing some loud rock music at full volume. The sound filled the RV instantly, drowning out the growling and banging outside. "Ready?" Dad asked. Tom swallowed hard and nodded again. Dad opened the door just enough for Tom to toss the speaker outside into the clearing. The music blared through the trees as Dad slammed the door shut again and locked it. For a moment, everything went quiet. No banging, no growling, nothing. "Did it work?" I whispered. But before anyone could answer, something slammed into the side of the RV so hard it knocked us all off our feet. "They're angry now," Mom said quietly, her face pale. And then we heard it. A deep, guttural roar that shook the entire RV. The roar was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just loud. It was deep, vibrating through the walls of the RV and straight into my chest. For a moment, none of us moved. We were too scared to even breathe. What was that?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling. Dad didn't answer. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and stood by the door, his face pale but determined. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "stay together." The RV shook again as something heavy slammed into it, denting the walls. The growling and banging were back, louder and more furious than before. It felt like they were trying to tear the RV apart. "We can't stay in here," Mom cried. "They're going to break through." Dad looked around desperately, his eyes landing on the emergency hatch in the ceiling. "We'll climb out," he said quickly. "We'll make a run for it." "Run where?" Tom asked, panic rising in his voice. "We're trapped. The road doesn't go anywhere." "We'll figure it out," Dad snapped. "But we can't stay here." He climbed onto the table and pushed open the hatch, peering outside cautiously. The night was dark, but the moonlight lit up the clearing enough for him to see. "They're all around us," he muttered. "Then how are we supposed to get out?" Mom asked. Dad hesitated for a moment before turning to me. "Lisa," he said, "your hearing aid. Can you use it to block out their sound for all of us?" I shook my head. "It only works for me," I said quietly. "But maybe I can distract them." "No," Mom said immediately. "You're not going out there." "It's the only way," I insisted. "If I can get them to follow me, you'll have a chance to get away." "Absolutely not," Dad said firmly. "We're not splitting up." Before anyone could argue further, something slammed into the roof of the RV so hard it cracked the ceiling. "We don't have time for this," Tom shouted. I took a deep breath and made a decision. While everyone was distracted, I climbed onto the table and pulled myself through the hatch before anyone could stop me. "Lisa!" Mom screamed. I dropped down onto the roof of the RV, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The air was cold and every shadow seemed alive. I could see them now. Tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes moving through the trees, circling us like predators stalking their prey. "Hey!" I shouted as loudly as I could. "Over here!" The creatures stopped moving for a moment, their glowing eyes all turning toward me at once. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Come and get me!" I yelled again, waving my arms. One of them stepped forward slowly, its long claws glinting in the moonlight. It let out a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. Then, they all started moving toward me. I jumped off the roof and ran as fast as I could into the woods, my hearing aids still turned off so I wouldn't hear their growls or roars. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I ran blindly through the trees, not daring to look back. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, their footsteps heavy and fast. They were close, too close, but I didn't stop, running. I just had to keep them away from my family long enough for them to escape. I kept running, my lungs burning and my legs aching with every step. The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around me like they were trying to trap me. I could hear the creatures behind me, their footsteps growing louder and faster. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I'd freeze, and that would be the end of me. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, but I caught myself just in time. My hearing aid was still off, so I couldn't hear their growls or roars, but I could feel them, like a weight pressing down on me. They were close, too close. Then, out of nowhere, the howling started again. It was loud and piercing, echoing through the trees and making my ears ring, even with my hearing aid off. I stopped for a moment, gasping for breath, and looked around. The howling wasn't coming from the creatures. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. For a split second, the creatures hesitated. They stopped chasing me and turned toward the sound of the howling instead. It was like they were afraid. I didn't wait to find out why. I turned and ran again, heading back toward the RV as fast as I could. My family needed me. I couldn't leave them behind. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the RV's headlights shining through the trees. Mom was standing outside, waving her arms frantically. "Lisa, hurry!" she screamed. I sprinted toward her as Dad started up the RV's engine. Tom was inside, yelling for us to get in. Mom grabbed my arm and pulled me into the RV just as Dad hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, speeding down the dirt road as fast as it could go. The creatures burst out of the woods behind us, their glowing eyes shining in the darkness. They chased us for a while, their long claws scraping against the sides of the RV, but eventually they fell back, like something was pulling them away. The howling grew louder as we drove, and when I looked out the window, I saw something strange. A figure standing in the middle of the road behind us. It was tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes like the creature's, but it wasn't chasing us. It just stood there, watching as we drove away. "What is that?" Tom whispered. None of us answered. The road finally opened up into a highway, and Dad didn't stop driving until we reached a small town hours later. We parked at a gas station and sat there in silence for a long time, trying to catch our breath. "We're safe now," Dad said finally, though his voice sounded hollow. But deep down, none of us really believed him. As we stepped out of the RV to stretch our legs, a police car pulled into the gas station parking lot. A tall officer stepped out and walked toward us with a friendly smile. "Evening," he said casually. "You folks all right?" Dad nodded quickly. "Yeah. We're fine." The officer looked at each of us closely before saying, "You're lucky you made it out of Howling Pines." My stomach dropped. "How do you know about that place?" I asked quietly. The officer smiled again, wider this time, and for a split second, his eyes glowed yellow in the dim light. "Because not everyone does," he said softly, and then he walked away. My name is Alexis, and I'm the youngest of 3 siblings. Growing up, my brothers, Daniel and Michael, always treated me like the baby of the family, even though I'm just 2 years younger than Michael. Daniel, the eldest, was always the responsible one, while Michael was more of the carefree type. Me? I was somewhere in between. This story happened last winter, and it still haunts me to this day. It was supposed to be a fun hunting trip in the mountains. Daniel had been planning it for months, a chance for us to bond before life pulled us in different directions. He said it would be just like old times. I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending days in freezing weather, but Michael convinced me to come along. "It'll be fun," he said. "We'll make memories." We packed up our RV with all the essentials: food, blankets, weapons for hunting, and even a few board games for when we'd sit around the fire at night. The drive to the mountains was long but peaceful. The snow-covered trees stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, and the world felt quiet, almost too quiet. When we arrived at our destination, Daniel parked the RV near a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. He called it the Starving Grounds. The name alone gave me chills. Apparently, it was a nickname locals had given this area because hunters who ventured too far into these woods often disappeared without a trace. Michael laughed it off when Daniel told us about it. "Sounds like a ghost story to scare kids," he said. But Daniel wasn't laughing. "It's not just a story," he said firmly. "I heard about it when I came here years ago with Dad. People say there's something out here, something that hunts you if you're not careful." I rolled my eyes and tried to brush off his words, but deep down, they stuck with me. The air felt heavier here, colder than I expected. Even though the sun was shining, there was an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. We spent the first day setting up camp and scouting the area for signs of deer or elk tracks. Daniel was in his element, giving us instructions on where to look and how to stay quiet so we wouldn't scare away any animals. Michael joked around as usual, pretending to trip over branches and making me laugh despite my uneasiness. That night, we sat around a small fire outside the RV, eating canned soup and telling stories from our childhood. For a moment, everything felt normal, like we were just 3 siblings enjoying each other's company in the middle of nowhere. But as the fire crackled and the wind picked up slightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, and every now and then I thought I heard faint whispers carried by the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked suddenly. "Hear what?" Michael replied with a grin. Nothing, I muttered, shaking my head. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Daniel glanced at me but didn't say anything. He looked tense, like he was listening for something too. As we climbed into the RV to sleep that night, I couldn't help but glance out the window one last time at the dark forest surrounding us. Something about this place felt wrong. And this was only the beginning. The next morning started off quietly. The sun peeked through the trees and the snow on the ground sparkled like tiny diamonds. Daniel was already outside, checking his gear, while Michael was still snoring in his bunk. I sat by the RV window, sipping some hot chocolate and staring at the forest. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. "Wake up, lazy," Daniel called out to Michael, tossing a rolled-up pair of socks at him. Michael groaned and stretched like he'd been sleeping for days. All right, I'm up." We spent the morning hiking deeper into the woods, following tracks Daniel had spotted near the clearing. He said they might belong to deer or elk, but something about them didn't seem right to me. The tracks were spaced oddly, almost like whatever made them wasn't walking normally. I didn't say anything, though. I figured Daniel knew what he was doing. As we walked further into the forest, the air started to change. It got colder, much colder than it had been earlier, and the wind picked up out of nowhere. The trees swayed gently at first, but soon they were creaking loudly as if they were struggling against something stronger than just wind. "Looks like a storm's coming," Daniel said, glancing at the sky. The clouds had turned gray and heavy, blocking out the sun completely. "Storm?" "It was clear just an hour ago," Michael said, looking confused. Daniel didn't reply right away. He just kept walking, his eyes scanning the area like he was looking for something. Or someone. By noon, the storm had arrived in full force. Snow fell thick and fast, covering the ground in a blanket of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, and every step we took felt harder than the last. "We need to head back," Daniel said firmly. "This isn't normal." I didn't argue. My fingers were numb despite my gloves and my face stung from the icy wind. Michael grumbled under his breath but followed us as we turned around and tried to retrace our steps back to camp. That's when we heard it, a faint cry for help somewhere in the distance. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah." "It sounded like someone's hurt," Michael added. We stood there for a moment, listening as the voice called out again. "Help! Please!" It sounded weak and desperate, like whoever it was didn't have much time left. Without thinking twice, Daniel started moving toward the sound. "Wait! What if it's not safe?" I called after him. "We can't just leave them," he shouted back over his shoulder. Michael and I exchanged a nervous glance before following him deeper into the storm. The snow was so thick now that I could barely see Daniel ahead of me. My heart pounded in my chest as we got closer to the voice. It felt like every step was pulling us further into something we couldn't escape from. Finally, we found him. A man lying face down in the snow near a cluster of rocks. His clothes were torn and covered in frost, and he wasn't wearing any gloves or boots despite how cold it was. "Hey, are you okay?" Daniel asked as he knelt beside him. The man lifted his head slowly and looked at us with wide, glassy eyes. His face was pale, almost gray, and his lips were cracked from the cold. I got lost," he whispered weakly. "Please, help me." Daniel helped him sit up while Michael pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Thomas," he replied after a long pause. Something about him felt off, like he wasn't fully there, but I didn't say anything. He looked so helpless that I couldn't bring myself to question him. "We'll take you back." "To our camp," Daniel said firmly. "You'll be safe there." Thomas nodded slowly but didn't say anything else as we helped him to his feet and started walking back toward camp. The storm seemed to ease up slightly as we moved closer to our RV, but that uneasy feeling in my chest only grew stronger with each step. Thomas stumbled several times on our way back, mumbling things under his breath that none of us could understand. When we finally reached camp and got him inside the RV, Thomas sat silently on one of the bunks, staring at nothing in particular, while Daniel handed him some hot soup. Michael leaned over to me and whispered, "Doesn't this guy seem weird?" I nodded but kept my voice low so Thomas wouldn't hear us. "Yeah, something's not right." Daniel overheard us and shot us a look that said, "Drop it." So we did, for now. But deep down, I knew this storm wasn't just some freak weather event, and Thomas wasn't just some lost hiker. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. Thomas didn't say much after we brought him into the RV. He sat on the edge of the bunk, holding the bowl of soup Daniel had given him, but he barely touched it. His hands were shaking, and his eyes kept darting around the room like he was looking for something, or maybe someone. "Are you feeling better?" Daniel asked gently. Thomas nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "Thank you," he said in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. Michael leaned against the counter, watching Thomas closely. "How did you end up out there?" he asked, breaking the silence. Thomas hesitated before answering. I don't remember," he said slowly. "I was hiking with some friends, but something happened." "What do you mean, something happened?" Michael pressed. Thomas's eyes flicked to Michael, then back down to his soup. "The storm came out of nowhere. We got separated. And then—" His voice trailed off and he stared at the floor like he was trying to piece together his own story. "And then what?" I asked softly. Thomas looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he whispered. "I just remember running." "Running? From what?" I wanted to ask, but the look on his face stopped me. He looked terrified, like whatever had happened out there was too horrible to put into words. Daniel sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "Just rest." Thomas nodded again but didn't say anything else. He set the bowl of soup aside without finishing it and lay down on the bunk, curling up like a child, trying to hide from a nightmare. The rest of the day passed quietly, but the tension in the RV was impossible to ignore. Michael kept pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath about how strange Thomas was acting. Daniel tried to stay calm, but I could tell he was worried. Too, he kept glancing out the window like he was expecting something to happen. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about what Thomas had said. I just remember running. Running from what? The storm? Or something else? That night, we decided to sleep in shifts so someone would always be awake in case Thomas needed help, or in case something else happened. Daniel took the first shift, while Michael and I tried to get some sleep, but sleep didn't come easily for me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, soft and faint, like they were coming from far away but growing closer with each passing moment. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe the wind outside, but then I realized they were coming from inside the RV. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around. Michael was snoring softly on his bunk, and Daniel was sitting by the window with his rifle resting on his lap. But Thomas was sitting upright on his bunk, staring straight ahead with a blank expression on his face. "Thomas?" I whispered hesitantly. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. "Are you okay?" I asked again, louder this time. Thomas turned his head slowly to look at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Something dark and hollow that made my stomach turn. "I'm fine," he said flatly before lying back down and closing his eyes. I wanted to wake Daniel and tell him what had just happened, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was that same dark feeling I'd seen in Thomas's eyes. Whatever it was, I stayed quiet and lay back down, pulling my blanket tightly around myself as if it could protect me from whatever was out there. Or in here. The whispers didn't stop that night. If anything, they grew louder and closer. This Next morning, I woke up to the sound of Daniel and Michael arguing in hushed voices. The RV was cold, colder than it should have been, and when I sat up, I noticed frost on the windows. My breath came out in small white puffs as I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. "What's going on?" I asked, rubbing my eyes. Daniel turned to me, his face tight with worry. "Thomas is gone." "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "He's not in the RV," Michael said, his voice sharp. "We woke up, and he wasn't here." I glanced at the empty bunk where Thomas had been sleeping. The blanket was still there, but it looked like it hadn't been touched all night. My heart started racing as I remembered how he'd been acting, staring blankly, speaking in that flat voice, and those whispers. "Maybe he went outside," I said weakly, though I didn't believe it myself. "In this weather," Michael snapped. "No way." Daniel grabbed his jacket and rifle. "We're going to look for him," he said firmly. "He couldn't have gone far." Michael sighed but nodded, pulling on his boots. "Fine, but if we don't find him soon, we're leaving. This whole thing is messed up." I stayed behind in the RV while they searched the area. Sitting there alone felt unbearable. The silence was too loud, and every creak of the RV made me jump. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see Thomas staring back at me from the tree line. After what felt like hours, Daniel and Michael returned, without Thomas. "No sign of him," Daniel said grimly as he closed the door behind him. "It's like he just vanished." Michael threw his hands up in frustration. "This is insane. First that storm, now this guy disappears? What's next?" I didn't say anything. I didn't want to admit it out loud, but part of me was relieved Thomas was gone. There was something about him that didn't feel human. We spent most of the day inside the RV, trying to figure out what to do next. Daniel wanted to stay one more night in case Thomas came back, but Michael was against it. "We should leave now," Michael argued. "Whatever's going on here isn't normal." Daniel shook his head stubbornly. "We can't just abandon him." As they argued, I noticed something strange outside the window. A pile of snow near the tree line that looked like it had been disturbed recently. It wasn't much, but it stood out against the otherwise smooth blanket of white. "Hey," I said quietly, interrupting them. "Look over there." They both turned to look where I was pointing. "What is that?" Michael asked. "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't there before." Without another word, Daniel grabbed his rifle and headed outside to investigate. Michael followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath about how this was a bad idea. I stayed by the window, watching as they approached the disturbed snow. When they got closer, I saw Daniel kneel down and brush some of it away with his gloved hand. "What is it?" I called out through the window. Daniel didn't answer right. Away. When he finally stood up and turned back toward me, his face was pale. "It's bones," he said slowly. "Animal bones." Michael stepped back quickly, shaking his head. Nope, that's it, we're leaving." But before they could take another step back toward the RV, a low growl echoed through the trees. I froze in place, my eyes darting around as I tried to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, almost like a voice trying to mimic a growl. "Get inside," Daniel shouted as he raised his rifle. Michael didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted back to the RV while Daniel kept his eyes on the trees, scanning for whatever had made that sound. When Daniel finally came back inside and locked the door behind him, he looked shaken but determined. "We're not alone out here," he said quietly. "No kidding," Michael snapped. "So let's leave already." But Daniel shook his head again. "If we leave now without knowing what's out there, we might not make it back." His words sent a chill down my spine, not just because of what they meant, but because deep down, I knew he was right. That night was even worse than the one before. The whispers came back, but this time they were louder, clearer, closer. And then there were footsteps. soft at first but growing louder as they circled around the RV again and again, until suddenly they stopped. We all sat there in silence for what felt like hours until finally, something scratched against the side of the RV, a slow, deliberate sound that made my blood run cold. None of us dared to move or make a sound as whatever was out there continued its slow circling, waiting for us to slip up. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped again. But we knew, whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was waiting for us to make our next move. The next morning, none of us spoke much. We were all on edge, after what had happened the night before. Michael was pacing back and forth in the RV, muttering about how we needed to leave immediately. Daniel sat by the window, his rifle resting on his lap, staring out at the snow-covered forest as if he was waiting for something, or someone. I stayed quiet, trying to process everything. The whispers, the growls, the scratching. It felt like we were being hunted. But by what? An animal, a person, or something else entirely? As the day dragged on, things only got stranger. Daniel decided to check the traps we'd set for game, near the edge of the clearing. Michael and I stayed behind in the RV, too nervous to go outside. When Daniel returned, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "What's wrong?" I asked. He held up one of the traps. It was empty, but the metal was bent and twisted like something had ripped it apart with incredible force. "There's no way an animal did this," he said quietly. Michael stared at the trap, his face pale. "What are you saying? That something stronger than an animal is out there?" Daniel didn't answer. He just set the broken trap down on the counter and walked over to the window again. That evening, as the sun began to set, we heard it again. The growl. But this time, it wasn't far away. It was close. Too close. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly, gripping his rifle tightly. "Stay inside," he said firmly before stepping outside into the cold. "Are you crazy?" Michael hissed. "You can't go out there alone." But Daniel didn't listen. He closed the RV door behind him and disappeared into the snow, grabbed a knife from the counter and stood by the door, ready to follow if something went wrong. I stayed frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened for any sign of danger. Minutes passed like hours until, suddenly, there was a loud crash outside, a sound like something heavy hitting metal. Michael didn't wait. He threw, opened the door, and ran outside after Daniel. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my coat and following them into the freezing night. What I saw made my blood run cold. Daniel was standing near one of our traps with his rifle raised, aiming at something in front of him. Michael stood a few feet behind him, clutching his knife tightly. And then I saw it, the thing they were staring at. It was tall, much taller than any human, with long limbs that looked almost skeletal. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness like two burning coals. Its mouth hung open slightly, revealing sharp teeth that looked like they could tear through anything. I wanted to scream or run or do something, but I couldn't move. I just stood there frozen as it stared back at us with those glowing eyes. "What is that?" Michael whispered hoarsely. Daniel didn't answer. He just fired his rifle. The shot echoed through the clearing, but when it hit the creature, it barely flinched. Instead, it let out a horrible screech that made my ears ring and sent chills down my spine. And then it moved. Fast. Too fast for something so tall and thin. It darted toward Daniel with unnatural speed, forcing him to fire again and again as he backed away toward us. "Get inside," he shouted as he reloaded his rifle. We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted back to the RV as fast as we could while Daniel covered us from behind. When we reached the door, Michael yanked it open and shoved me inside before climbing in after me. Daniel followed seconds later, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it tightly. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, panting heavily as we tried to process what had just happened. "What? What was that?" I finally managed to say. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but it's not human." Michael sank onto one of the bunks, his face pale and his hands trembling. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Now." Daniel didn't argue this time. He grabbed his keys and started up the RV while Michael kept watch by the window with his knife still in hand. As we drove away from the clearing and into the dark forest roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with us yet. The RV rattled as Daniel drove down the narrow forest road, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness ahead. Snow was still falling, but it wasn't as heavy as before. The silence inside the RV was unbearable. None of us said a word. We were too scared, too shaken by what we had just seen. Michael sat by the window, gripping his knife tightly and peering out into the trees. I sat on the bunk, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to convince myself that we were safe now, that whatever that thing was, it couldn't follow us. But deep down, I knew better. "Do you think it's gone?" I whispered. Michael glanced at me but didn't answer. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Then we heard it. The screech. It was faint at first, like it was far away, but it grew louder with each passing second. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't coming from behind us. It was coming from ahead. "Stop the RV!" Michael shouted suddenly. Daniel slammed on the brakes and the RV skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. The headlights illuminated something standing in our path, something tall and skeletal with glowing eyes that burned like fire. It was the creature. How did it get in front of us?" I stammered. Daniel didn't answer. He grabbed his rifle and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night without hesitation. "Are you crazy?" Michael yelled after him. "You can't fight that thing." Daniel turned back to us, his expression grim. "If we don't stop it here, it'll keep coming after us," he said firmly. "Stay inside." Before Michael or I could argue, Daniel shut the door behind him and walked toward the creature with his rifle raised. My hands were shaking as I watched him through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The creature let out another screech, a sound so loud and piercing that it made my ears ring, and then it charged at Daniel with terrifying speed. Daniel fired once, twice, 3 times, but it didn't slow down. It moved like a blur, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it closed the distance between them. "Daniel!" I screamed. Michael didn't hesitate. He threw open the door and ran after him, clutching his knife tightly. I wanted to stop him, to pull him back inside where it was safe, but I couldn't move. Fear had rooted me in place. Outside, Daniel and Michael fought desperately to hold off the creature. Daniel fired shot after shot while Michael slashed at it with his knife whenever it got too close. But no matter what they did, it just kept coming, like nothing could hurt it. And then something changed. The creature stopped suddenly and turned its glowing eyes toward me through the RV window. For a moment, everything went still, like time itself had frozen. And then I heard it, a voice, not a growl or a screech this time, but a whisper, soft and chilling, speaking directly into my mind. "Hungry." I gasped and stumbled back from the window as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't just hunting us. It wanted us, all of us. Outside, Daniel must have noticed what was happening because he shouted something to Michael that I couldn't hear over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then he did something I'll never forget. He ran toward the creature with his rifle in hand, not to shoot it, but to distract it. "Run!" he yelled at Michael as he waved his arms wildly to get its attention. "Get her out of here!" "No!" I screamed as I realized what he was doing. "Daniel, don't!" But he didn't listen. He kept running toward the creature until finally, it turned its attention away from me and toward him instead. Michael hesitated for a moment before grabbing me by the arm and pulling me out of the RV. "We have to go," he said urgently. "But Daniel, he knows what he's doing," Michael said firmly, though his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "We can't let his sacrifice be for nothing." Tears streamed down my face as Michael dragged me away from the RV and into the forest. Behind us, I could hear Daniel shouting at the creature, taunting it as he led it away from us. And then there was silence. Michael didn't stop running until we were far from the RV and deep into the forest. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't think about that. All I could think about was Daniel, how he'd sacrificed himself to save us. "Do you think he's okay?" I asked breathlessly as Michael finally slowed down and leaned against a tree. Michael shook his head, his face pale and his breathing heavy. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But if we go back now, it'll get us too." I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't just leave Daniel behind, but I couldn't find the words. Deep down, I knew he was right. That thing, whatever it was, couldn't be stopped. We stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, trying to find a road or some sign of civilization. The snow had started falling again, covering our tracks and making it harder to see where we were going. Every sound made me jump. Branches snapping, wind whistling through the trees. It all felt wrong. "We're lost," I said finally, my voice trembling. Michael didn't respond. He just kept moving forward like he was afraid to stop. Eventually, we found a small cabin tucked away in the woods. It looked old and abandoned, but it was shelter, and right now, that was all we needed. Michael pushed the door open cautiously, his knife still in hand, and stepped inside. The cabin was empty except for a few broken chairs and a dusty table in the corner. It smelled damp and musty, but it was better than being out in the open. "We'll stay here for now," Michael said as he closed the door behind us and locked it with a rusted latch. I sat down on one of the broken chairs, my hands still shaking as I tried to process everything that had happened. Daniel was gone. That creature was still out there somewhere. And now, we were trapped in this cabin with no idea how to get home. As the hours passed, the silence became unbearable. Michael sat by the window staring out at the snow-covered trees while I tried to keep myself from falling apart. But then, something changed. I started feeling strange, like my body wasn't my own anymore. My hands felt colder than usual, even though I was wearing gloves. My chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on me. And then there were the whispers. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. "Michael," I said hesitantly. He turned to look at me, his expression concerned. "What's wrong?" "I don't feel right," I admitted, my voice shaking. Michael walked over to me and placed a hand on my forehead like he was checking for a fever. His eyes widened slightly as he pulled his hand away. "You're freezing," he said urgently. "Are you sick?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But something's wrong." Michael stared at me for a moment before glancing out the window again nervously. "We need to get out of here," he said firmly. "Now." But before we could move, I heard it again. The screech. It wasn't far away this time. It was close. Too close. Michael grabbed his knife and stood by the door, his body tense, as he listened for any sign of movement outside. The whispers grew louder in my head until they were deafening, like they were coming from everywhere at once. And then, I realized something horrible. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside me. "Michael," I said weakly as tears filled my eyes. "I think it's happening." "What are you talking about?" he asked urgently. "I think it's in me," I whispered. Michael stared at me in shock as realization dawned on him. "No," he said firmly. "You're fine. You're just scared." But I wasn't fine. And deep down, we both knew it. The coldness in my body grew stronger with each passing second until it felt like ice was running through my veins. My vision blurred slightly as the whispers became clearer, almost like they were speaking directly into my mind, telling me what to do, what to become. "Michael," I said again, my voice barely audible now. He stepped closer to me cautiously, his knife still in hand but his expression filled with fear and sadness. "I'm sorry," I whispered as tears streamed down my face. And then, everything went black. When I woke up hours later, Michael was gone, and so was the cabin. I found myself standing alone in the middle of the forest with snow falling softly around me. My body felt different, stronger but colder, emptier somehow. And then I saw it. The creature standing a few feet away from me with its glowing eyes fixed on mine. It didn't attack or screech this time. It just stared at me silently before turning and disappearing into the trees. As I stood there alone in the snow-covered forest, I realized something horrible. Daniel hadn't stopped it. Michael hadn't escaped it. And now, I had become part of it. My name is Dr. Robert Hayes. I'm an archaeologist, but not the kind you see in movies. I don't carry a whip or dodge rolling boulders. My work is quieter. Dusty books, ancient ruins, and long nights piecing together the stories of people who lived thousands of years ago. But this one is different. It all started with a rumor, a whisper about an unexplored section of Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. The canyon is famous for its stunning red cliffs and ancient petroglyphs carved by the ancestral Puebloans. But there was something else about it, something darker. Locals spoke of strange disappearances and shadows that moved on their own. They warned people to stay away from certain areas, calling them cursed. I didn't believe in curses. To me, the canyon was just another puzzle waiting to be solved. My goal was simple: to uncover artifacts that could rewrite history and make my name unforgettable in the academic world. But I wasn't going alone. Emily Zhao, my research assistant, was coming with me. She was brilliant, sharp-eyed, and quick-thinking, but she had a habit of over-analyzing everything. Then there was Miguel Ortiz, our guide. He grew up near the canyon and knew its trails like the back of his hand. Miguel wasn't thrilled about this trip. He kept saying we were messing with things we didn't understand. At the time, I thought he was just being superstitious. We arrived at the canyon on a chilly October morning. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. The cliffs towered over us, their deep red color glowing under the rising sun. It was beautiful but unsettling, as if the canyon itself was watching us. Miguel led us to a spot near some ancient burial caves where we set up camp. He muttered something about how we shouldn't stay too close to the caves, but I brushed it off. "We're here for science," I said with a grin. Emily smiled nervously, but Miguel just frowned. That first night, things started to feel off. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, carrying whispers that seemed too human to be natural. Our RV lights flickered for no reason, even though everything had been working fine earlier. Emily swore she heard footsteps outside her tent when no one was there. I laughed it off and told them they were just imagining things. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Miguel's warnings weren't just superstition after all. The next morning, we woke up to a strange stillness, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The wind had stopped completely, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dry ground as we prepared to start exploring. Miguel led us deeper into the canyon. He walked ahead, his shoulders tense like he was bracing for something. Emily stayed close to me, her camera swinging around her neck. She was snapping pictures of everything, the cliffs, the carvings, even the shadows that danced across the rocks. "This place is incredible," she said quietly. It feels alive. I nodded but didn't say anything. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it too, like we weren't alone. The canyon seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that you couldn't hear but could somehow feel in your chest. We reached a cluster of caves by mid-afternoon. The openings were small and dark, like empty eyes staring out at us. Miguel stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "We shouldn't be here," he said firmly. "These are burial caves. They're sacred." I sighed. "Miguel, we've talked about this. We're not here to disturb anything. We're here to learn." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. Instead, he stood back while Emily and I carefully examined the carvings on the walls near the entrance. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, spirals and symbols that seemed to shift slightly when you looked at them too long. "Do you see that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" I replied. She pointed at one of the symbols, a jagged line that looked like a lightning bolt. "It wasn't there a second ago," she said. I frowned and leaned closer. It was definitely there now, etched deep into the stone as if it had always been there. I told myself she must have missed it earlier, but something about her expression made me uneasy. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Miguel insisted we head back to camp before dark. "The canyon changes at night," he said cryptically. I wanted to stay longer, but I could tell Miguel wasn't going to budge. So we packed up our gear and started back toward camp. The shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, twisting into shapes that didn't quite make sense. That night was worse than the first. The wind had returned, but it wasn't just howling. It was screaming. It sounded like voices, angry, desperate voices, rushing past our tents and rattling our equipment. Emily came into my tent around midnight, her face pale as a sheet. "Robert," she said shakily, "I saw something." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "It was tall and thin, standing by the caves, but when I looked again, it was gone." I wanted to tell her she was imagining things again, but I couldn't bring myself to say it this time. Instead, I just nodded and told her to try to get some sleep. But neither of us slept that night. The next morning, none of us talked about the night before. Emily looked tired, her eyes ringed with dark circles, and Miguel seemed even quieter than usual. I tried to shake off the uneasiness as we packed our gear and headed back to the caves. This was supposed to be a scientific expedition, not some ghost story. When we reached the caves, Miguel hung back again, muttering something under his breath in Spanish. Emily and I ignored him and got to work. We set up our equipment, cameras, lights, and a portable scanner to analyze the carvings. That's when we found it. Inside one of the caves, hidden behind a loose slab of rock, was a small wooden box. It was old, really old, and covered in strange markings that matched the carvings outside. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were a few artifacts: a stone pendant shaped like an eye, a bundle of feathers tied with leather string, and what looked like a piece of bone carved into a spiral. Emily leaned in closer, her camera clicking away. "These don't belong here," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed at the bone spiral. "This carving style is completely different from anything we've seen in this region. It's almost modern." I frowned. She was right. It didn't make sense. The artifacts should have been thousands of years old, but they looked like they could have been made yesterday. I decided to run some tests on them back at camp. As we packed up the box, Miguel finally spoke up. "You shouldn't take that," he said firmly. I turned to him, annoyed. "Miguel, this is why we're here, to study things like this." He shook his head. "You don't understand. That's not just an artifact. It's a warning." "A warning about what?" Emily asked. Miguel hesitated, his eyes darting toward the caves. "The spirits," he said finally. "They protect this place. If you take something that doesn't belong to you, they'll come for you." I wanted to laugh it off, but there was something in his voice, something raw and fearful, that made me pause. Still, I wasn't about to let superstition stop me from doing my job. "Nothing's going to happen," I said firmly. "We'll be careful." Miguel didn't argue anymore, but he kept glancing over his shoulder as we made our way back to camp. That night, I ran some tests on the artifacts using our portable lab equipment. The results didn't make any sense. The carbon dating came back with wildly inconsistent readings. One moment it said the artifacts were over 10,000 years old. The next moment it said they were less than 50 years old. Emily sat across from me, her face pale in the glow of her laptop screen. "Robert," she said softly, "look at this." She turned her laptop around to show me a photo she'd taken earlier that day. A shot of the cave entrance with Miguel standing nearby. But there was something else in the photo too, something that hadn't been there when she took it. In the shadows behind Miguel was a figure, tall and thin with glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the image. "It's probably just a trick of the light," I said weakly. Emily didn't respond. She just closed her laptop and sat back in her chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to keep warm. That night, none of us slept again. By the third day, the tension was impossible to ignore. Miguel barely spoke, and Emily seemed distracted, constantly glancing over her shoulder like she was expecting something, or someone, to appear. I tried to keep us focused on the work, but even I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We decided to explore a new section of the canyon that afternoon. The cliffs were taller here, casting long shadows across the ground. The air felt colder, even though the sun was shining brightly overhead. Miguel led the way, his eyes scanning every rock and crevice like he was searching for hidden dangers. As we walked, Emily stopped suddenly and pointed at a nearby wall. "Robert, look." I followed her gaze and saw what she was pointing at, more carvings. But these were different from the ones we'd seen before. They looked newer, like they'd been made recently. The lines were sharp and clean, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. "What do you think it means?" Emily asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of warning." Miguel stepped closer and studied the carvings for a moment before speaking. "They're not warnings," he said quietly. "They're invitations." "Invitations to what?" I asked. Miguel didn't answer. He just turned away and started walking again. We spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the carvings and collecting samples from the surrounding area. But as the sun began to set, strange things started happening. Emily's camera began glitching, showing distorted images on its screen, shapes that looked like faces but weren't quite human. Our portable radio picked up faint chanting in a language none of us recognized, even though there was no one else around for miles. And then there were the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't behaving normally. They moved differently from everything else, slipping across the ground in ways that didn't match the position of the sun. Emily noticed it too. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "Robert, look at that." She pointed at a shadow near one of the caves, a tall, thin shape that stretched across the ground but didn't seem connected to anything. It stood still for a moment before sliding away into the darkness. Miguel saw it too. He muttered something under his breath and pulled out a small pouch from his backpack. He sprinkled its contents, a mix of herbs, on the ground around us, and said something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Protecting us," he replied without looking up. I wanted to tell him it wasn't necessary, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but I couldn't bring myself to say it this time. Deep down, I knew he might be right. As we headed back to camp, the shadows seemed to follow us, darting between rocks and trees like they were watching our every move. By the time we reached our tents, all three of us were on edge. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, soft voices calling my name from somewhere deep in the canyon. When I finally opened my eyes, I thought I saw something standing outside my tent, a tall figure with glowing eyes, but when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell Emily or Miguel about it in the morning, but judging by their pale faces and tired eyes, I wasn't the only one who'd seen something. By the fourth day, the canyon felt different. It wasn't just the strange carvings or the shadows anymore. It was the air itself. It felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on us. Miguel was more withdrawn than ever, barely speaking unless he had to. Emily kept her camera close, snapping pictures of anything that seemed even slightly out of place. That evening, as the sun began to set, something happened that none of us could explain. It started with a sound, a low drumming noise that echoed through the canyon. At first, I thought it was coming from our equipment, but when I checked, everything was turned off. The sound grew louder, more rhythmic, like it was coming from all around us. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Miguel froze and looked toward the horizon. "It's them," he said quietly. "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the cliffs. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw it, a mist creeping through the canyon like a living thing. It wasn't like normal mist. It moved too quickly, swirling and twisting as if it had a mind of its own. The drumming grew louder as the mist approached, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily stepped closer to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Robert, what is that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. Miguel grabbed his pouch of herbs and started sprinkling them on the ground again. "Don't move," he said firmly. "Stay inside the circle." I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, but something about the mist made me listen. It stopped just short of our camp and hovered there, swirling in place like it was watching us. And then Emily did something I'll never forget. She stepped forward, just outside Miguel's circle, and reached toward the mist. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Emily!" Miguel shouted. "Get back!" But she didn't listen. She took another step closer, her fingers brushing against the edge of the mist. For a moment, nothing happened, and then she froze. Her eyes widened as if she'd seen something we couldn't see, and she gasped sharply before stumbling backward into Miguel's circle. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She shook her head, her breathing shallow and uneven. I don't know," she whispered. "I saw faces." "Faces?" Miguel asked urgently. Emily nodded. "They were looking at me, calling me." Miguel muttered another prayer under his breath and tightened his grip on his pouch of herbs. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "We're not leaving," I said stubbornly. "We've come too far to turn back now." Miguel glared at me, but didn't argue. Instead, he turned his attention back to Emily, who still seemed shaken by whatever she'd seen in the mist. That night, Emily had dreams, or at least that's what she called them. She woke up screaming in her tent around midnight, shouting names we didn't recognize. "Diane! Foster!" When we rushed to her side, she was trembling and drenched in sweat. "I saw her," she said breathlessly. "She was standing in the mist, calling for you." "For me?" I asked, confused. Emily nodded slowly. "She said your name." I didn't know what to say. Diane Foster was my ex-wife, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, and there was no way Emily could have known about her. But somehow, she did. Miguel looked at me sharply. "This isn't just about the canyon anymore," he said darkly. "It's about you." The next morning, Emily was quiet. She barely touched her breakfast and kept staring at her hands like she was searching for something. Miguel didn't say much either, but I could tell he was watching her closely. I tried to keep things moving, pretending everything was normal, but the tension was impossible to ignore. As we packed up to explore another section of the canyon, Emily suddenly gasped. "Robert, look." I turned to her and saw what she was pointing at, her arms. There were faint markings on her skin, like carvings etched into the surface. They looked almost identical to the symbols we'd seen on the cave walls. "What is that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," she whispered. "I woke up with them." Miguel stepped closer and examined her arms carefully. "They're not just symbols," he said grimly. "They're messages." "Messages from who?" I asked. Miguel didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his pouch of herbs again and sprinkled some over Emily's arms. "This might help," he said softly. Fade. Markings faded within minutes, but the uneasiness lingered. Emily seemed distant, like she was somewhere else entirely. Her eyes had a faraway look, and she kept glancing toward the cliffs as if she was expecting something to appear. As we made our way deeper into the canyon, strange things started happening again. The animals were the first to change. Birds flew, in erratic patterns, circling above us before disappearing into the mist. Lizards darted across the rocks in frantic bursts of movement, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they ran. Even the insects seemed affected, buzzing loudly before falling. Silent all at once, Miguel stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw them. Humanoid shapes moving through the mist. They were tall and thin, their bodies flickering like shadows caught in a beam of light. They didn't seem solid, but they moved with purpose, gliding across the ground without making a sound. "What are they?" Emily whispered. Miguel shook his head. "Spirits, or something worse." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there had to be a logical explanation, but I couldn't find the words. Deep down, I knew he might be right. As we approached another set of caves, Emily stopped suddenly and stared at one of the entrances. "She's here," she said softly. "Who's here?" I asked. Emily turned to me slowly, her eyes wide with fear. "Diane." Miguel grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward us. "Don't go near it," he warned, but Emily didn't listen. She broke free from Miguel's grip and stepped closer to the cave entrance. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was being drawn towards something she couldn't resist. "Emily!" I shouted. "Stop!" She paused for a moment and turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy like she was in a trance. "She wants you," she said quietly. Before I could respond, Miguel grabbed her again and pulled her away from the cave entrance. He muttered another prayer under his breath and sprinkled more herbs around us. Emily seemed to snap out of it after that, but she was shaken, more than ever before, and refused to talk about what had happened. As we headed back to camp that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. "She wants you." The next morning, we were shaken, but determined to keep going. I told myself that whatever was happening could be explained, that it was just a mix of exhaustion, stress, and the strange atmosphere of the canyon. But Miguel wasn't convinced. He kept saying we were pushing too far, that we were messing with things we didn't understand. Emily barely spoke at all, her eyes constantly darting toward the mist. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, Professor Thornton arrived. Thornton was my longtime rival, a man who had spent years trying to outdo me in the academic world. He wasn't supposed to be here. This expedition was unauthorized, something I had planned in secret. But somehow he had found out and brought his own team into the canyon. I spotted them as we were heading toward another set of caves. Thornton and 3 other researchers, all carrying heavy equipment and looking far too confident for their own good. Thornton grinned when he saw me. "Well, well," he said smugly. "Fancy seeing you here, Hayes." "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "Same thing as you," he replied casually. "Making history." Miguel muttered something under his breath and stepped closer to me. "You need to tell them to leave," he said quietly. "They're not going to listen," I replied. Thornton's team wasted no time setting up their equipment near one of the caves. They didn't seem bothered by the mist or the strange carvings. They acted like they owned the place. Thornton even laughed when Miguel tried to warn him about the spirits. "Spirits?" Thornton scoffed. "Come on, Hayes, don't tell me. You're buying into this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Miguel said firmly. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Thornton rolled his eyes and turned back to his team. "Let me know if you find anything interesting." He called over his shoulder. I wanted to argue with him, but I knew it would be pointless. Thornton was reckless, always had been, and there was no way he was going to back down now. As the day went on, strange things started happening again. Thornton's team began taking risks, entering caves without proper precautions and removing artifacts without documenting them properly. Miguel warned them repeatedly, but they ignored him every time. And then one of Thornton's researchers disappeared. It happened late in the afternoon while they were exploring a particularly deep cave. The researcher, a young man named Alex, had gone inside alone to take measurements while the rest of us waited outside. When he didn't come back after 20 minutes, Thornton went in after him. When Thornton finally emerged from the cave, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "He's gone," he said quietly. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked. Thornton shook his head. "I don't know. I couldn't find him." Miguel stepped forward and looked at Thornton sharply. "This is your fault," he said angrily. "You shouldn't have come here." Thornton didn't respond. He just turned away and started packing up his equipment, clearly shaken by what had happened. That night, none of us slept again, not even Thornton's team. The mist returned around. Midnight, creeping closer to our camp than ever before. The drumming was louder now, almost deafening, and the shadows moved faster, darting between tents like they were searching for something, or someone. Emily woke up screaming again, shouting names we didn't recognize. "Diane! Foster!" Thornton's team looked terrified, huddling together like scared children. Miguel sprinkled more herbs around our camp and muttered another prayer under his breath. "We need to leave," he said firmly. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. By the 5th day, the canyon felt like it was closing in on us. The mist was thicker now, swirling around our camp even during the day. The drumming never stopped, echoing through the cliffs like a heartbeat. Thornton's team was falling apart. 2 of his researchers refused to leave their tents, and Thornton himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. Miguel kept warning us that we were running out of time, but I wasn't ready to listen. Not yet, and then things got worse. It started with Thornton's remaining researcher, a woman named Claire. She had gone off alone to take more samples near one of the caves, ignoring Miguel's warnings to stay close to the group. When she came back an hour later, something was off. Her movements were strange, jerky and unnatural, like she wasn't fully in control of her body. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, and she didn't respond when Thornton asked her what had happened. "Claire," Thornton said again, his voice shaking. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him and started stacking rocks in a circle near the edge of the camp. Miguel froze when he saw what she was doing. "Stop her," he said, urgently. "What's wrong?" I asked. Miguel pointed at the rocks. "She's building a skinwalker circle." "A what?" Emily asked. Miguel didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed his pouch of herbs and rushed toward Claire, shouting at her to stop. But before he could reach her, she turned to face him, and her expression wasn't human anymore. Her face twisted into something unnatural, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She let out a low growl and lunged at Miguel, forcing him to stumble backward. Thornton ran toward her, shouting her name, but she didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she continued stacking rocks in the circle, her movements faster now, more frantic. "What is she doing?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Miguel turned to me sharply. "She's opening a gateway." "A gateway to what?" I asked. Miguel didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the center of the camp. "We need to stop her," he said urgently. Thornton tried to grab Claire again, but she pushed him away with unnatural strength. He fell to the ground, staring at her in shock as she finished stacking the last rock in the circle. The moment the circle was complete, the mist surged forward, swirling around Claire like it was alive. The drumming grew louder, almost deafening now, and shadows began pouring out of the mist like liquid darkness. Emily screamed as one of the shadows darted toward her tent, its shape twisting into something vaguely human before disappearing into the night. Miguel grabbed his pouch of herbs and started chanting in Spanish, sprinkling the herbs around us as fast as he could. "Stay inside the circle," he shouted. Thornton scrambled to his feet and ran toward Claire again, shouting her name over and over. But before he could reach her, she turned to face him. And this time, her face wasn't hers anymore. It was something else entirely, something ancient and terrifying. Her features had twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and hunger, her glowing eyes fixed on Thornton like a predator sizing up its prey. Thornton froze in place as Claire lunged at him, with inhuman speed. He screamed as she grabbed him by the shoulders and dragged him into the mist. And then they were gone. The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that made my ears ring. The mist began to retreat slowly, swirling back toward the cliffs, until it disappeared completely. Miguel collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily as he muttered another prayer under his breath. Emily sat next to him, trembling uncontrollably as tears streamed down her face. I stared at the empty space where Thornton and Claire had been moments ago, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. "What just happened?" I asked finally. Miguel looked up at me with tired eyes. "The skinwalkers took them," he said quietly. The camp was silent after that. None of us spoke as we huddled together, too afraid to move, too shaken to think. Miguel stayed close, clutching his pouch of herbs like it was the only thing keeping us safe. Emily sat with her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the ground. I didn't know what to say or do. For the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. When the sun finally rose, it brought no comfort. The canyon looked different in the daylight. Emptier, colder. It felt like whatever had been watching us from the shadows had retreated. For now. But we all knew it wasn't over. Miguel was the first to speak. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "Now." Emily nodded silently, but I hesitated. Something was holding me back. A feeling I couldn't explain. It wasn't just about the artifacts or the carvings anymore. There was something personal about all of this. Something I hadn't fully understood until now. And then I remembered Emily's dream. The names she had shouted in her sleep. "Diane Foster," I said aloud. Miguel and Emily both looked at me, confused. "That's my ex-wife's name," I explained. "Emily? You said she was calling for me." Emily frowned. "I don't know how I knew her name," she admitted. "But I saw her. In the mist." Miguel shook his head. "This isn't a coincidence," he said darkly. "The spirits are connected to you somehow." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. There was something about this canyon, something about the mist and the carvings and the shadows that felt tied to me in a way I couldn't explain. Desperate for answers, I decided to go through my belongings, hoping to find some clue that would make sense of everything. That's when I found it. A journal tucked away in one of my bags. It wasn't mine. It belonged to Diane. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The pages were filled with notes and sketches, diagrams of symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones we'd seen on the cave walls. There were also entries describing dreams she'd had about the canyon, dreams of mist and shadows and drumming. One entry caught my attention. The skinwalkers are not just legends. They are real. They are guardians of this place, but they are also something more, something older than we can understand. They exist between worlds, using this canyon as a gateway. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read her words. Diane had been researching this place long before I ever came here. She must have known something she hadn't told me. Another entry made my hands tremble. Robert is connected. To them somehow. His family, his bloodline. It's part of why they're drawn to him. I closed the journal and looked up at Miguel and Emily, my heart pounding in my chest. "They're after me," I said quietly. Miguel nodded grimly. "That's why they haven't taken you yet," he said. "They need you for something." Emily looked terrified. "What do we do?" she asked. Miguel hesitated before answering. "We have to close the gateway," he said finally. "How?" I asked. Miguel pointed toward the cliffs where we had seen the mist retreat earlier. "There's a place deep in the canyon," he explained. "A place where their power is strongest. If we can seal it off, we might be able to stop them." I didn't like the sound of it, but I knew we didn't have a choice. If we stayed here any longer, we wouldn't survive another night. We didn't waste any time. Miguel led the way, moving quickly but cautiously through the canyon. Emily stayed close to me, clutching her camera like it was a lifeline. I carried Diane's journal in my hand, flipping through it as we walked, searching for anything that might help us. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the drumming returned. Soft at first, but growing louder with every step. "This is it," Miguel said finally, stopping in front of a narrow passageway between two cliffs. "The gateway is just ahead." I peered into the passageway and felt my stomach churn. The mist was there, swirling thick and heavy like a living thing. It seemed to pulse in time with the drumming, its edges flickering with faint shadows that moved too quickly to follow. Emily hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Miguel nodded grimly. "If we don't do this now, they'll keep coming." I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The mist enveloped me immediately, cold and damp against my skin. I could barely see, more than a few feet ahead, but I kept moving, following Miguel's voice as he called out directions. And then we reached it. The gateway wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't a door or a portal. It was a circle of stones arranged in a perfect spiral on the ground. The carvings on the stones glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light that made my head spin if I looked at them too long. "This is where it begins," Miguel said quietly. "What do we do?" I asked. Miguel pulled out his pouch of herbs and began sprinkling them around the spiral. "We need to break their connection to this place," he explained, "but it won't be easy." As he worked, the mist began to shift. The shadows within it grew darker, more defined, until they started to take shape. Tall, thin figures with glowing eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. "They're here," Emily whispered. The figures moved closer, circling us like predators, stalking their prey. Miguel continued chanting under his breath, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. One of the figures stepped forward and stopped just outside the spiral. It was taller than the others, its form more solid, more human-like. And then it spoke. "Robert," it said in a voice that was both familiar and alien at the same time. I froze. "Diane," I whispered. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by my confusion. "You should not have come here," it said. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "You are one of us," it replied simply. "Your bloodline ties you to this place. You cannot escape it." I shook my head. "I don't belong to you." The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You cannot fight what you are," it said. Before I could respond, Miguel shouted something in Spanish and threw a handful of herbs at the figure. It recoiled with an ear-piercing scream, its form flickering like static on a broken TV. "Now!" Miguel shouted. "Destroy the spiral!" Emily grabbed a rock and started smashing one of the glowing stones while Miguel continued chanting. I hesitated for a moment before joining, her using all my strength to break apart the spiral. The mist surged around us angrily, and the drumming grew deafening. The figures lunged toward us but couldn't cross the boundary Miguel had created with his herbs. They screamed and writhed as we destroyed their connection piece by piece. Finally, with one last blow, the spiral shattered completely, and everything stopped. The mist vanished instantly, leaving only silence behind. The figures were gone too, their forms dissolving into nothingness as if they had never been there at all. We stood there for a moment, breathing heavily as we stared at the broken stones on the ground. Is it over? Emily asked softly. Miguel nodded slowly. For now, he said, but they'll always be here, waiting. We made our way back to camp in silence, too exhausted to speak. When we reached our tents, I found myself staring at Diane's journal again. Her words echoed in my mind. They exist between worlds, using this canyon as a gateway. I knew she was right, and I knew that even though we had stopped them, today they would always be watching, waiting for another chance. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave the canyon for good, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something inside me. The canyon had left its mark on all of us, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever truly be free of it.